The first thing that I want to cover are the basics. The basics are quite similar, but to jump into it, let's see what CarPlay is and what Apple likes to say about CarPlay, and it's that it's a smarter and safer way to use your iPhone when you're driving. It sounds basically like Tim Cook said it, and perhaps he did, but yeah, that's the idea behind it. And in general, the question is, what do we get with CarPlay when we use it with a device that we don't get with a phone? And the primary reason to use it is that you get a bigger screen, so you don't really have to have a phone in your arms. You're focused on the road itself. You get easier interaction, which is the most important thing here. You have bigger controls on the device, and the thing that's been more hyped recently is also a hands-free experience that you get by using voice assistants, which you get kind of for free if you use mobile devices, because you get Siri on iOS, for instance, and you can just talk to her and do some of the actions on the device or on the car itself if you have an OEM app. That's the important part here, and that's something that we're going to be discussing. There's a difference between just a regular template app that you get if you're developing a specific types of apps, and an app that you develop as an OEM. And the last part here is that you get a familiar user experience, because everyone is used to their mobile device, and this is exactly what you get on your screen when you're using CarPlay. So I'll just go over the few features that you're mostly familiar if you drive, and that's what you get is maps and navigation. You can actually answer calls, and you can listen to music, and a bunch more things. But these are some of the most useful ones that we usually see in the cars. And now the question is, why are these important? Well, because Apple doesn't really allow us to use any kinds of apps to present in CarPlay, actually. You can only have specific types of apps or specific types in general, and these are the apps. The list is finite. So if your app isn't one of these and you want to do something, like if your app is, I don't know, something like isn't a messaging that's related to food, but it's not actually related to delivery, you won't be able to create your app. And the reason for that is that you need to pass a bunch of rule sets that Apple has when you apply to actually get the entitlements to create the app. We'll also touch a bit on this as we go forward. And the question now is, how does CarPlay work? Well, people tend to think that CarPlay is something that's running separately as a separate app, but it really isn't. It's just an extension of your application. It's running on your device. Everything is running on the device, and the screen is actually really dumb. It just listens to what the device has to say and renders that. That's the entire idea behind it. And the biggest thing that you get from it is that the events that you, or your taps or anything else that you do on the screen, are forwarded to your device, and then the device does all the heavy lifting. So it does calculations, it does any requests or anything else that it needs to do to be able to serve that content to your car. That's the most important part. As I mentioned, Apple has a bunch of guidelines. I only set them in red here and added a link, because there's 66 pages of things and guidelines that are related to CarPlay and implementation details. And we don't have time to go over this, but yeah, it's quite extensive. And if you want to actually end up developing an app for CarPlay, this is a great resource to go over, because everything is explained, which is awesome, from starting off to actually implementing a feature or a template. So how does the system itself work? We can go into more details with the picture, because it's a bit easier to understand. So going from bottom up, your phone establishes a wireless connection to your vehicle. To get that wireless connection, we need to do a few things, but we'll get there. Important thing is that the phone talks over Wi-Fi to your vehicle. Then there's an IP protocol in between, a communication plugin, which isn't really important here. And then we have the rendering part, or the message communication receiving part between the car and the phone. And we use this to render audio, to render video, to basically pretty much show anything to the user. And then there's EAP2, protocol that's basically used to send sensor and metadata to the vehicle, from the vehicle to the phone. What this does is, like, if you want to track like your average speed or something of the sort, like consumption of fuel, battery status, or so on and so forth, this is going to come over the EAP2 protocol. And that's basically the gist of it, of how it works. But how is the connection established? Initially, we get a Bluetooth connection. That part is important. It all starts with Bluetooth. Once the Bluetooth is connected, we need to exchange credentials with the vehicle itself. So this part needs to be encrypted as well, because if it isn't, and if you don't care about it, someone from the outside can come and hook onto your car and do wonders if they do it, like with your router and everything else. So this part is important to be encrypted, and then you basically use the credentials to establish a Wi-Fi connection with the vehicle. Once that is done, you can like disable the Bluetooth connection. From this moment onwards, everything that's coming from the vehicle is going to be coming over the Wi-Fi. Why Wi-Fi? Well, mostly because it's easier to send data over Wi-Fi, and it's much faster at the end of the day. And like sending video and audio over Bluetooth wouldn't be an enjoyable experience, let's call it like that. So that's the main reason here. Bluetooth is still used though, this is important, and it's used for discovery and reconnection. So if you drop a connection, Bluetooth is still going to be jumping in to establish that connection again, because if you remember the graph before, it's used to establish the initial connection, so it's still needed. And it's also used as support for the communication protocols, mainly EAP2 that I mentioned, that's used here. There's another protocol that Apple uses, and that's EAP. It's similar but different in pronunciation, and it's called External Accessory Protocol. Basically, what this does for you is that if you implement it and use this as a layer between your connection and your device, it's going to treat your device as an accessory that's connected in some way. So if that way is Bluetooth or if it's USB, it's not really important, because the protocol handles the communication layer. What's great about it is that you get either way for free. If you just go and do connection over Wi-Fi or connection over USB, you might end up dropping one of the two when you interact with the vehicle. So that's why it's important. And what happens when you connect your phone and end up using your phone to do anything with CarPlay, this is what's being used in the background for you. And also, it's like the entire documentation part about the AP is connected to the MFI accessories. If you don't know, MFI accessories are made for iPhone accessories. So, for instance, your iPods, your AirPods, your pretty much anything else that is Apple related can be, or pretty much any other accessory that's a third party, they can implement the protocol itself, and then your device is going to recognize it as if it's part of the ecosystem. This is cool, and that's why CarPlay feels native. Well, it's not. It can run Android or anything else, as Tim already mentioned. That usually it runs Android, but that's the idea behind it. Now, how do we actually get started with it? The first thing that we need to do, that I mentioned earlier, is the entitlements. We need to contact Apple for this. And we need to give them like explanation of what our app is going to do, what type of app it is, if you remember from the start. And then they say, okay, that works. We're going to give you the entitlements. We get an identifier, and that identifier is then used to actually display the app. If you try to like do anything CarPlay related without that identifier, you simply won't see your app in CarPlay at all. It won't appear. And then we need something to test, obviously, and we have two types of simulators. The first one is a standalone app that acts like a CarPlay simulator, like on your Mac. The main difference between this one and the Xcode simulator is that you can hook your device, like your phone, to it, and the device is going to act like it's hooked to your car, which is great. Like if you actually, I don't know, turn music on your phone, it's going to turn on your laptop as well. Essentially, your laptop is going to mimic the car, which is awesome for some advanced testing compared to the regular Xcode simulator. But usually, dedicated hardware is best. So you likely want to avoid the car until the last part of the testing, because sitting in a car, even if it's an expensive one, for like 5 to 6 hours and debugging might sound fun at first, but after a while it's not fun. for you and for your back either. But it's not necessary to actually be in the car like all the time. There's also dedicated hardware that you can buy. You can buy a small infotainment unit or a small screen that acts as an infotainment. There's like devices to buy for $100 or so, and you can use that to hook onto it and see how it interacts with the hardware itself. So that's also there. Now, the entitlements that I mentioned, you don't really have to focus on the list. There's a lot to go through here. But if you focus just on the key part, you'll notice here that it actually corresponds to the types of apps that I mentioned earlier. So you can see CarPlay audio, CarPlay communication, driving test, charging, and so on. Basically, what you're getting from Apple is, okay, your app is supposed to be a driving task app, and you're supposed to implement that feature, and you get that identifier. Once you get this and add it into your app, it's going to appear in CarPlay, and you can use it just like any other app that's available in CarPlay, an OEM app as well. The setup itself is actually fairly simple, even though it might sound complicated. All you need to do from the implementation point of view, if you're working with the templates, the easier part of the work is to include the framework. Once the framework is included, you include the entitlements that we've seen on the last screen. Once that part is done, you just need to implement the CarPlay scene delegate, and we'll look into this a bit later. Just a sample code that you see how it looks. And you simply pass data to that scene delegate. Once that is done, you need to configure a simulator so that you can actually run it on something, and the CarPlay scene delegate basically handles everything else for you. This is essentially representing the screen that you're seeing in your car and handling every interaction and giving it back to you. That's the idea behind the delegate. It's basically a callback. And now, just to look at the simulator and how it looks, this is the one that you can install as a standalone app. It has all of the controls as well. So if you want to test if the knob for interaction works as well, other than swiping, only swiping, you can test it out here, because like through accessibility, and that's really cool, you can actually implement knob controls in your app as well, so you can like go over buttons, icons, and everything else. You don't necessarily have to use only touchscreen. For cars that don't use touchscreen, then you get this for free, because that's the only way to interact with the app. And then the second one is the ISCOT simulator one. It's essentially the same, looks a bit more barren, but it does this job to get the initial implementation done as well. Now let's touch a bit on the templates that I've been mentioning for quite a while. Templates are basically fixed, and they're provided by Apple. So when I say templates, I really do mean this. Like, we have templates of how a screen needs to look and how a component on a screen needs to look in order to represent a piece of data. And if you aren't an actual manufacturer or someone who actually makes cars and are able to use some of the neat little additions that we'll see a bit later, you won't be able to use anything else. So if you're using your food app and you want to implement something, templates are basically the only thing you'll have available for you. So it's still cool to actually implement it if it works for you, but it's pretty restricted, as you'll see. And data flow, of course, needs to be organized around the scene delegate that I mentioned, because all of the data that comes into CarPlay and goes off from it needs to be handled in that single class, which can be a bit annoying depending on how much data you need to do. And one important part that people tend to forget is that your screen can be locked or usually is locked when you're using CarPlay. And for people that actually developed on iOS here, you might know that your keychain ends up being locked when your screen is locked. So if you need some data from your keychain and your phone is locked, you're out of luck. All of that data needs to be supplied much more before and cached somewhere to be able to use it in CarPlay, which can be annoying depending on the use case. But yeah, another part that the only thing I keep saying are limits, but it's cool, I promise, is that the templates, depending on which type of app you're using, you have a limit of levels for templates, like navigation and so on. So the default limit is 5 templates, so that you can't really stack too many screens per se. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because you don't really want to present a bunch of things for the user, and they need to tap all of them to close them, and they go into a car accident. So that's not good. That's primarily why there are limits. And then depending on the app type, it's even less. I don't really know if there's a reasoning for the limits, like on these exact numbers, but they're there. And the templates are basically this. So some of these are the usual ones that you are familiar with iOS. For instance, grid is basically a collection view, nothing smart. List is a table view. You get this for free from the template side, but as you can see here, this is what you're limited to. So if you want to make a list, and you want to customize that list and add something else in it, you won't be able to do that because like the only thing that you can do is add text and an icon, and that's about it. Action sheet as well, a regular sheet that we've used to that just pops up from the bottom, and the screen that most people are used to is the now playing one, which basically any app that plays music uses. So either your Apple Music or Spotify, all of them use that to render what's happening in the car. And these templates, yet again, are depending on the app type, are limited to the app type. So it makes sense that action sheet, list, tab bar, and so on are not really limited, and every app can use them. But if we go down and further a bit, then like point of interest isn't really available for audio because it doesn't make really too much sense. Now playing, of course, is limited to audio and communication because you can actually display what's playing in your vehicle there. So these limits kind of make sense, but on the other hand, if you want to do something a bit more custom, you won't be able to do it with the templates. The code itself is relatively simple. Well, this one is. Depending on what you need to load, it might be a bit more code there. But essentially what you need to do is just create the list item, embed that item into a section, and then embed that into something that's going to be a root view. For instance, in this case, I've just used the tab bar so that we get like 2 tabs and 2 lists, and that's about it. But this, of course, from the templates that I've shown before, can look like anything else that you've seen in a car, depending on the template list. And now let's touch a bit on the OEM apps. Now, OEM apps have a bunch more control over the regular template apps. Why? Because you basically get to do your layout from scratch. So what you end up doing is creating just another iOS app, which is great from one end. From other end, it's going to cost more because you need to create the entire layout. So you can't really come on and create any type of layout and just call it a day. It also needs to follow Apple's guidelines. So no like colors all over the place. It can't run videos like on buttons and so on and so forth. It still needs to have that CarPlay look and feel that you get with templates, but you can organize the layout much more. And still, when you go and publish an app, Apple is going to look at it and say, okay, this looks okay, but you're stretching with this. For instance, we've had one feature that was a media gallery, and images were like rolling, scrolling between the few that we selected. And this was one of the features that they said, okay, you can use that, but this is stretching it thin a bit because. Like from your side, you'll always see something happening on the infotainment, and that distracts the driver, which then, of course, isn't a good thing. Of course, another good thing is that you can use EAP, as I mentioned, and you can be really close to the hardware. So when you implement the protocol, and we talk about this a bit more later, you're basically sending bytes and doing with these bytes whatever you wish. While definitely being more work, it also enables you to optimize how the data is being sent, like at what rates, and do a bunch of other things that you can do, like on the devices that are generally closer to the hardware. Additional control over the data flow, so you don't really have only one entrance like you had with a scene delegate. You would still need to inject it into your CarPlay screen or CarPlay window, because essentially CarPlay is just another window. It's nothing smart. We'll talk about this as well. It runs, as I mentioned, more akin to a usual app. Like you can do whatever you wish with the layout, and you'll see that in a bit as well. But before all of that fun things that you can actually start doing, you need to enlist for MFI, and you need to pay for that. I think it's $100 or something a year, which Apple then needs to verify and say, okay, you can actually be enlisted in the MFI program, and you can do something that you wish to do. Of course, for this, you need a reason, so you can't really come and say, maybe you can, I don't know, but they say that they require you to have an accessory that you want to work on. So it's best to have one if you want to ensure that you get unlisted. But yeah, documentation is private, so everything that is related to this, like you can't see it before you get enlisted. So if you want to develop, you need to enlist and spend some money, and then you get bombarded with a bunch of I think there's like several documents with hundreds of pages, and basically explaining all of the protocols and everything else. There's quite a lot. So yeah, that part is interesting. And yeah, the part that I was mentioning, that CarPlay isn't really anything smart in a separate app. Basically, this is all that happens. Like when your app starts, you check for the user interface idiom, and you see if it's CarPlay. If it is, you load a separate window that is going to show CarPlay. Otherwise, you just render your usual phone screen, and that's about it. The only thing that needs to happen here, of course, is that you pass your data that you need to pass into the like CarPlay content view that's going to be reading something from the app or whichever other source of data. And now, EAP, to go a bit more into this as well, as I mentioned initially, it ensures that your vehicle is connected to your accessory. In this case, actually, the vehicle ends up being the accessory, not the entire car, but the infotainment unit, and it also ensures that the connection is made either over Bluetooth or over USB. That's the important part. And like, if you don't use EAP, you need to handle USB and you need to handle a Bluetooth connection. And that can become an issue because if you hook USB, it's going to override your connection and you can just lose it, which can be annoying. And that's why it's simply better to use it right from scratch. And this is something that Apple recommends as well. And I mentioned it multiple times, but it's really important that Apple requires whitelisting. So you as a manufacturer need to approve someone that wants to develop, in this case, a CarPlay app. So you're making an infotainment, someone is developing it for you. They need to be whitelisted. They're actually going to be making something for your infotainment unit. And the important part here, as I mentioned for templates as well, is to have a protocol registered, and then the app is going to appear. Otherwise, you won't see anything on the either on the infotainment or on your simulator either. That's about it regarding EAP. And for the actual connection and actual code that you need to use, Apple basically gives you a framework. It's called EA Session and EA Accessory Manager. You use this to get close to the hardware, and this is the part that I mentioned that gets you close to that gets you to send your bytes and exchange data. Basically, EA Session opens a stream between you and the car, and you send data using the streams that you get from it. It's a low-level interface, which is great. For these cases, it makes much more sense than having a high-level interface. And of course, the Accessory Manager also provides a list of accessories, in this case, infotainments or anything else that you're working on, so that you can actually pick it up. Like you ask your Accessory Manager, hey, is there something that I can connect to? It lists your infotainment unit or anything else that you can hook onto, and then you need to establish a connection. Of course, this is extremely simplified because you likely need a handshake to connect to the car and have some sort of security layer there, because otherwise everyone would be able to connect to the vehicle, which we don't really want to either. And yeah, the biggest benefit of all this is that you get a bunch of complexity that you can introduce into the app, and you can basically use a bunch of functions. And when I say functions, I mean vehicle functions. So if your app is, I don't know, a music app, you really don't need to do anything else with the car. And it makes sense to use template because it's going to be cheaper first, and it's going to be extremely faster because you only need to hook up a few things and you get it working. On the other hand, if you're an automaker, you would likely want to use this to make some of the functions that were in the infotainment unit, for instance, HVAC or temperature settings, or I don't know, ambient light controls or so on. You get it so much closer to the user with a single tap, and you'll see this in an example when we go to the simulator and the example apps. And yeah, as I mentioned, like you can do a bunch of things with like climate controls, sun profiles, AC, ambient lighting, anything that the car supports, and of course that is available on the infotainment unit of the car, because infotainment at the end of the day does request on the car itself. Now let's move on to the templates. Like I'll go over them really fast because I just showed how they look, and this is how they end up being implemented. Like the default settings apps is a regular list that you can use. The now playing component or the template that you've seen ends up looking like this for pretty much any app, in this case for Spotify. And of course the phone app ends up looking like this. Like you can have tabs that ends up being the root view here, or the root template, and then you can embed a bunch of other things in. This of course applies to your app as well. Like the part at the top that you see here, favorites, recents, contacts, and keypad, is something that you can embed as well as templates. Important note, as templates. So these tabs can't really be anything you wish. They need to be templates as well. But on the OEM part of the implementation, you can make something like this, which is not that different at first glance, but if you take a look at it, you can see that, like, apart from the few boxes that you have here, you also have a vertical scroll at the right. So you can add a bit more a bit more functionality into the box on the right, and you can basically distribute anything in terms of controls how you wish. Still, as I mentioned, you need to make like the buttons big, like this, so that if you want to use the controls, you actually tap on them easily and that you don't miss them when you're driving. Apart from this, you can also make it a bit more complex. Like if you want to separate a bunch of controls that are related explicitly to the car, you can make a separate screen and have them all there. A cool thing that you also can do that most cars can't is create templates. So let's say that I want to have a template for my heating and HVAC in a car. I would just select a few options here and hold to save that template. The next time I get in the car, I just tap on the template, and every setting that I had before would turn on, and I just continue on driving as well. These are just examples of a few functions that you can use. Basically, this is limited by the functionality of the car itself, so it can pretty much do anything. And of course, the data flow doesn't necessarily have to be limited to the car itself. You can do a bunch more things, like you can have services that aren't connected to the car, like AQI, weather, or something like that. Like you can have weather, and then you get a notification when you're getting close to a city that the weather is not great and that you slow down, for instance. You can have AQI so that you know that if you're going into an area that's extremely polluted, or a town that's extremely polluted, so that you don't actually open your windows and that you watch out for it. In this particular case, you can have a separate service that the car actually uploads data to, and you can pull it down and like show some historical data about speed, G-force, or anything else that you find cool. So that's the idea behind it. This is something that we can't really do as much with templates. You can pull data like from a service and do it, but you can't really do it as complex as this. And to start wrapping things up, so the main benefit of the OEM custom implementation, as I call it here, is that like you get to build more advanced UI and more advanced features. You get your custom data flows. You can hook to a bunch of other services that make sense for a car, or just as to enhance the user experience. Apart from this, it's definitely harder to implement. Like MFI enlistment alone costs some money, and then you have a bunch of documentation to go through once you pay that money. And of course, at the end of the day, you still need to handle the entire connectivity of the car as well, the entire layer, like the things that I've shown initially, like Bluetooth, connecting through Bluetooth. After it's handling the Wi-Fi connection and establishing basically a stream between the device and the car. This is something that you get pretty much for free with templates. So that's one of the benefits of the templates. And the last thing, like it's the last one, but I can't stress this enough. Most of the things in cars aren't standardized at all. Like every car, even like within a same group of cars, you can have completely different APIs between cars, and that can be really hard to actually like create a layer that can talk to the vehicles, and let alone within a group. Like if you have I don't know, Mercedes and someone else, and you create something for Mercedes, it's quite likely that you won't be able to use it at all for Volvo or something else. They're using completely different data sets most of the time. So that alone creates a difficulty where it's definitely an issue. But things are moving in the right direction, and industries are actually trying to make up standards or create standards so that most of them end up applying them. Some make better use of this. Some actually have entire documents of how standard needs to work, but some of the manufacturers don't have anything. So it's it's a jungle there, let's call it like that. On the other hand, with templates, as I mentioned, it's much easier to get it working fast. Like you have an app that you need, that you know that makes sense to implement in a car. It's one from the list that I shared before. You just implement the application delegate and you pass the data here, and that's about it. You have a working CarPlay solution. Much less scary than it actually appears. But of course, you get next to no customization. It's basically what Apple provides, and that's about it. And the data flows can be limited to the app application types as well. And yeah, so to wrap it up, adding CarPlay support can be straightforward, depending on what you want and depending on if you're an automaker at the end of the day. The supported application type is quite important. Like, it doesn't make sense to even invest any time to start like thinking about a solution and something to get something working in CarPlay if your app doesn't really support the use case. That list that I shared at the start, it's all in the guidelines as well, so you can read it there. The MFI certification is really important and has a lot of documentation that is private. So this is basically the first thing that you want to do if you want to start working for someone and implementing your app to handle CarPlay. So without it, it's pretty much impossible to do, unless you manage to get a hand of the documentation in other ways, but I wouldn't advise that. Basically, the biggest benefit for the automakers in this case is that they can highlight features that they can't handle better in their infotainment units. Some features just are buried, like you need to go into HVAC controls and you need to go a few levels deep and then you need to select something. And in this case, you would just have it as a single button on your interface right away when you connect your phone, which makes the benefit quite a bit bigger for the end user here. And so far, the feedback from the users that actually tried using a specific automaker application like this have been quite happy. So it definitely shows that it's something that it's worth investing into as well. And yeah, at the end of the day, to wrap it up with a single sentence, it's important to keep the layout simple, regardless of the choice, and not adding any distractions, because at the end of the day, the focus is on the actual driver and not on the app. It's just there to make their life simpler, but not at the cost of the driving experience. And yeah, that's about it. Are there any questions?
How do you get access to the CarPlay simulator?
How do you get access to the CarPlay simulator? You download it, basically. Yeah, there's nothing else you need to do. For the one that comes with Xcode, you simply run it through the settings and you run it right away. There's no issues there. And for the second one that actually hooks to the device and where the device ends up serving as an accessory as well, this one you download from their web, and that's about it. Works out of the box. The only thing, of course, is that, like I mentioned, if you're trying to run an app, and if it isn't enlisted there, you won't be able to see it. So that's important. Yeah. Yes.
So you say OEMs are just the normal car.
Basically, yeah. When I say OEM, I mean automakers. Basically, any manufacturer.
Where do they deploy the app? Do they deploy it to the phone, and then, for example, I'm a Skoda and want to have an app. I deploy it to the regular Play Store, and the drivers install it to their phones.
Yeah.
Connect to the car. To do Skoda stuff with the car.
Yeah, so usually your automaker is going to have an app already, some kind of app, especially bigger brands, like something to handle your car, see like how much fuel it has, and so on and so forth. And all you need to do in this case is to like get enlisted, get the identifier that I mentioned. Once you get this, it's immediately going to be start showing in the. It'll immediately start showing in the interface, which is another issue. You don't want to publish this before you have a feature as well. So otherwise, like if they hook it on their car and open the app, they're just going to see a blank screen there. So that's an important piece of work that needs to be, at least some piece of work needs to be done before you actually ship it out. But you ship it with your app and you just publish it to the store. That's it.
Is there some magical thing, for example, I turn my car on for the first time and automatically downloads it in my phone if I connect, or?
So the question is there some magical thing that happens for the first time when you're like opening the app or doing? Not like Yes and no, depending on how you implement the connection. If you do it through EAP, you can hook into the car immediately over Bluetooth. Like when the first thing you need to do is enable CarPlay in the car itself. Once that's done, it actually has its means to establish the connection between the vehicle. Once you do this and you come into the car for the first time, once you download the update, it's going to connect to the car, and if the identifier is there, since the identifier and entitlements are shipped with the app, it's just going to render it in the CarPlay interface. So essentially, you don't really need to do anything apart from connect to CarPlay, as you would usually do anyway, either to USB or through Wi-Fi.
One last question, if I may. Is there any difference between capabilities of different head units? For example, like an old car can display some subset of functionalities in a new car.
So yeah, the question is there a difference between capabilities between head units? And yes, definitely. Usually head units come with their own software or firmware, and depending on the firmware alone, they can already have like few less functionalities or capabilities alone. Usually firmware updates also depend on the cars. So let's say that you have a newer car, it likely won't, or an older car usually won't be able to run the newer firmware as it is with other devices as well. So that alone also limits what can be seen in each car. But that's actually a really good question, because it's one of the issues. Depending on how you implement like identifying your car, you might have an issue where you don't know which firmware is running on the vehicle. And if that happens, of course, then you don't really know what to show and what not, and then you kind of need to do a dance of like understanding in which vehicle you are to hide or show a few things, which isn't ideal. So thinking about firmware and versioning the firmware is really, really important. Yeah. Yep.
Terrific. Yeah. What's the actual difference between CarPlay extended and Android Automotive? Or like Apple OEM app, OEM app, or is it like a completely system as Android Automotive?
I didn't really hear you well. Could you come a bit closer and repeat? Sorry.
What's the difference between the CarPlay extended and the Android Automotive? So is this like a similar system, or is it like an app made by Apple using the normal issues?
That's a good question, which I don't really know.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah. I would assume that there's a difference, because, for instance, for CarPlay version 2, Apple is doing some changes that are going to like get applied to the entire display port of the vehicle. So not only the head unit, but for instance your piece of unit in front of you, where the kilometer per hour and everything else is basically. Yeah. So it definitely looks like it's something custom. In terms of software, in terms of hardware, like it's the same unit usually running the Android, but then something ends up hooking to. At least this is how I understood it, but yeah, it's not public, so it might be blatant lies. So don't quote me on that.
Also, the problem that nothing is done right is why it's late.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, like I said, it can depend on the vehicle itself. Like one vehicle can have some things, and then the next one comes out and it has a completely separate API, which, as you would expect, even with a regular app, that creates issues. So, one more.
So you mentioned the identifier that you have to get from Apple. How do you know, for example, you have two cars, each one from a different manufacturer, and both have CarPlay, you have both apps. How do you know how the correct app is shown?
So
what has to be done on car side?
The question is basically, how do we know, depending on our identifiers, which app is used in which car?
Yeah.
Basically, it functions like a bundle identifier. It's something that's unique for manufacturer. Like if you as a manufacturer apply for something, you will get your specific bundle ID, and then no one else will be able to get it. That's how it looks, and that's how it's registered. So I would assume that it works in the exact same manner as the bundle ID. It's not something that I've seen documented. So,
And one more. Okay.
Go on.
Do you mentioned that car just forwards the events to the phone and then the phone does the heavy lifting? Does it also render the views and just send the video signal, or does the rendering actually happen on the infotainment?
So the actual events
Yeah.
that are being sent, they are handled on the infotainment. They get sent to the device over some sort of an interface. This is something that we really don't know how it works because it's in the communication layer that I mentioned. And the only thing that we get is like a fallback. Hey, something was pressed over the communication layer, and then you can interact with it like you would do with a regular app. If that answers the question.
The question is more, does the phone also render the view which is get shown? Is it just a video signal, or is the actual rendering happening on the?
The phone handles everything apart from the video signal.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So the infotainment is going to handle the video signal.
Right.
Yeah. What?
Regarding the templates, you mentioned the MFI certification. Would you actually, if you're MFI certified, create a custom set of your own templates with each handle or communication that you mentioned and then pick in a library and sell it to other MFI?
So the question here is whether you can make an SDK with your own templates and then sell it to others. Yes. Basically, if you want to do this, of course you can. The main issue here is the standardization part that I mentioned, because like you can like sell the UI and some parts of the presentation logic there, but the entirety of the business logic is going to depend more closely to the API and overall like handling of the vehicle itself and the infotainment, because not every infotainment is also the same. So that might be an issue. But the first part, yeah, you can absolutely do that. So not a bad idea.
But you mentioned the API jungle. So there is no regulation, and what if we're looking at on the data security side? Why is that? What are your thoughts?
So data security doesn't really have a lot to do with it. It's mostly because every manufacturer comes up with their own API for their own infotainment, and they use it as such. They're accustomed to it. Someone is doing someone is doing for them. They haven't had the need to sync between multiple groups, for instance, and that's why it's sort of a jungle there, because it worked for them. It worked fine, and they didn't have a reason for a standard. But now when it's kicking off a bit, and like for instance, like we've got a question here is like, can we use templates and so on and so forth? It's starting to make sense to actually try and standardize at least within a group, right? Like if you're Volkswagen or something like that, and you want to like have a standard there, it makes sense for the entire group, because then every car manufacturer is going to use that standard, and then suddenly you don't have to implement a specific business logic part for every single. You use only one and you call it a day, and then you can use a single SDK.
Is there any manufacturer that is already aligned?
Honestly, I don't know. From the ones I've heard about, I don't think they are, so far at least. Yep.
I have two short questions.
Okay.
Will CarPlay get any support for app intelligence?
That's a good question. So the question is whether CarPlay is going to get support for Apple Intelligence, and we don't know. I wonder if it's going to get something for CarPlay version 2, because it's still not formally out. And if something is going to come, I assume it's going to be coming with it. But so far, we don't really have any info about it.
And the second one, maybe this is also to Tim. Up to this point, we're talking about CarPlay and Android Auto. Since Chinese car industry is eating the world, like, is there already a third competitor on the market? Like, is Xiaomi doing anything, Huawei, or anybody else?
I don't think there is at the moment, at the very least. I do think that it's going to be coming. Like if you take a look at how the situation ended up looking with Huawei, it wouldn't be that big of an issue for them to come up with something and push into the entire environment. Might be good as well, as it would ensure that there's more competition and then more features as well. But so far, I think that the CarPlay is quite a bit more advanced. in its second generation state that we're still kind of waiting for. Any more questions? No? Okay, then that's it.